Hello world, and welcome to this edition of Tech on Fire with Blaze. I'm Blaze Stewart, architect at Winelect, and today we're going to look at how to integrate Azure Kubernetes Services with Azure DevOps using Azure Kubernetes Services Deployment Center. Last week, we looked at how to use GitHub with GitHub Actions to do a container workflow. This week, we're going to be looking at how to do the same thing with Azure DevOps. And I wanted to do a brief review of what that would look like if we were using a container workflow on DevOps. So in DevOps, we have a code repo, which is going to have a Docker file in that. And then on Azure DevOps, it's going to create a pipeline for a build and a pipeline for a release. And the build is going to actually build the container that we're going to be using in our release pipeline, which we're going to ultimately end up with on Azure Kubernetes Services. So with a Docker file, the Azure DevOps is essentially going to call Docker build and turn that into a container image on a build agent that is running on Azure DevOps. And then it's going to call Docker push, and it's going to push that to a container registry. And that's pretty much where the build process on Azure DevOps will end. Once that's done, it will then take that image and push it off into a Azure DevOps release pipeline. And that's where it's going to take that image out of the container registry and push it into Azure Kubernetes Services. And to do that, it's going to call a run command. And to do that, it's just simply going to call something like kube create against a YAML file, and then it's going to push that down into Azure Kubernetes Services, where it will be then running as a image that gets turned into a container on Azure Kubernetes Services. I'm here in the Azure portal, and I have deployed into a resource group a container registry as well as a Kubernetes services instance. And I'm going to use these two to create a DevOps pipeline and integrated with Azure DevOps, which we'll look at in a moment once we get this deployed. But I already have on Azure DevOps a code repo that has a repository that has a Docker file in it and a Kubernetes manifest file that I'm going to be using for this deployment. Now, to make this work, basically all I really need to do is come over here and use the Kubernetes Service Deployment Center and then hook it up using this container registry. So we have, like GitHub Actions, and we have a container registry working with Kubernetes Services and GitHub Actions. In this case, we're using container registry, Kubernetes Services, and Azure DevOps for this particular pipeline creation. Now, I'm going to come down here and I'm going to use Deployment Center just like I did with the GitHub demo. And instead of selecting GitHub, I'm going to select Azure Repos here, and then I'm going to click Next. And if you haven't already connected Azure DevOps to your particular subscription on Azure, you might have to go through an authentication process. Otherwise, it's just going to show up here because I've already got this connected to my login and my Azure subscriptions already. So my Azure DevOps organization is going to be Blaze Apps, and I'm going to use this DOS game project that has my Commander Keen demonstration that I've used in other demos as well. It's got the same Docker file, the same code, and all that inside of that container. And I have given the same repository as well, and I'm going to use the master branch. Now on the next screen is where I'm going to choose my Docker file, and this is the one that it found in the root, which is the same Docker file I've been using for a number of demos. It's just basically creating the container. And here's where I can actually set up all of the ports and the build context for that as well, just like we saw with GitHub Actions. In this case, I'm just going to take all these defaults and pretty much leave it like it is, and then go to the next screen. I need to remember that environment user and password. I'm going to be using the password whenever I log in to my game through the VNC client. And once that's already set up, I can just click done, and then I can come back and look at what it actually sets up in DevOps when we swap over to DevOps. I'm here in my Azure DevOps instance, and I have, as part of this project, some code repos, and this is a standard code repo. It's a Git repo that I created for this particular demo, and we needed this repo to exist so that I could use the deployment center in Kubernetes to create the pipelines. And my repository just has a Docker file, a manifest file, and then the Commander Keen game files that I can use to install later on. But in any case, the Docker file that I'm using here is this one, and this is the one that I needed to connect the deployment center to this particular code repo whenever I went through that process. So the repository is nothing special, but unlike the GitHub Actions, it doesn't create manifest files in the repository, nor does it create workflows in the repository. It basically leaves the repository alone and just creates things underneath of the pipelines tab here. Now, under my pipelines, I have two pipelines that it created. It created me a build pipeline and a release pipeline. So my build pipeline is basically going to build a container image and then push that into a repository. So we've seen this already with the little slide demo that we had earlier where we saw what it actually did. So here is my release it's already done, my build it's already done, and I can edit this particular pipeline if I want to drill down into it. And here are the steps that it has. It has a build an image. It's basically going to be using the image generation process defined by whatever's in my Docker file, and it's going to push that to my container registry that I created already. So this is very standard. If you wanted to add additional steps to this, you can do that without messing up the integration with Azure Kubernetes Services. You could do a compile step, can then take the compiled code, put in a container, or you can modify the Docker file and then put it into the container and then update the container and push it all the way through the build process and then into the release pipelines as well. So this is fairly straightforward whenever we're looking at just a standard build pipeline. And you can come in here and you can look at the actual steps that it did down here. So initialize the job, checks the code out, builds the images, and this is the output from the build process. We're called the Docker build command. Here's the push to the container registry, and then again the final job checkouts, and then the cleanups that it does as part of the build process. So that's fairly straightforward, nothing special going on there. But I didn't have to create any of this. And when I did the integration with Azure Kubernetes Services, it set all this up for me to where I really don't have to change anything at all. The same thing is going to be true of releases too. So this particular release pipeline, I have a couple of steps that I can look at. I can come over here and look at this pipeline and drill down into the tasks that are related to this release pipeline. And it's going to do basic steps to get stuff running on Kubernetes. So this right here does a pull, and this pulling secrets from Kubernetes. And this is going to generate a Kubernetes manifest file that's inline. And what this allows me to do is create this inline manifest file. I can edit this without affecting anything. And I'm just going to take this one and use it as what I need for my application, since it's pretty much what I have already. It's a service with a load balancer, so it's going to be a public IP address, and it's running on port 80, so I don't need to change any of that. The only thing I'm going to change is the number of replicas to 1 for this particular build, and save that replicas. And once I have that saved, I just have one instance of my particular pod running. Now, with that in mind, I can also look at my deployments down here, and this is just going to take that generated manifest file and then deploy that to my Kubernetes cluster, which it's already connected to, so I don't have to enter any additional credentials. All of this was, again, generated by Kubernetes Deployment Center. I didn't have to create any of these pipelines manually, and so I can use Deployment Center, create this, modify this, and it's not going to impact my integration with Azure Kubernetes Services upstream or downstream. The last thing I want to look at is the actual triggers that make all of this happen. And if I go back into my pipelines here, my build pipelines, and I go to edit my build pipeline, I can look for triggers right here, and this will show me the triggers that I have turned on. And this particular one has a continuous integration trigger turned on. So that basically means anytime something gets checked into my master branch, it's going to kick off a build process, and then the subsequent downstream pipelines will get the triggers on them applied, which would be my release pipeline, and then ultimately end up in my Kubernetes cluster. So I can test this by simply changing something in my code repos, which I'm going to do. So to change something, I'm simply just going to come back over here to my repo, and I can edit maybe this Docker file, and I could say, I could put a comment in this Docker file if I want to, by adding in just something, maybe do something, change to trigger build. And that's going to be enough to cause this to actually make this thing work. So I'm going to commit that change and commit that. And then that's going to kick off the build process, and then it's going to kick off the deployment process. And whenever all this deploys, we should see a single instance of my pod running on Kubernetes. And with that, I should be able to get the public IP address using the CLI and then log into that and then play my little DOS game by using integration with Azure DevOps. So here we can see my pipeline that has been triggered now, and this was the actual comment that I had put on the change in my repository. So updated Docker file, so that comment I put in my Docker file did trigger the build. So I can drill down into this and then come down here into the builds, and we can see that it successfully built a new image and then pushed that image to the container registry right there, and everything checks out. I can come down here to my releases, and then I can see a new release here that was triggered by that second build. So release number 2 is the current one that is running on my Kubernetes cluster right now. So I can click into this, and here I can see that it all deployed. If I come down here, I can see the steps that it ran, that built a manifest file, and then you can see exactly what it's doing down here. And then down here, we can see, what it deployed and all those kinds of things that it put out into the Azure Kubernetes cluster. And then once I have that, I can then go back down into my command line and get the IP for this guy. And there it is. It's also right there inside of my command line right here, inside of the output here. But if I wanted to, I could use the CLI to get that as well. So if I run I've already connected this up to my Azure Kubernetes cluster. So if I go kubectl, I do and get namespaces, I can get listen to the namespaces because this is going to deploy it into the namespace according to the manifest file that I have out there. And that's the one that it created. So I'm going to do kubectl and get pods. And then I'm going to pass in the namespace that I got from the list namespaces. Like that. And there's the single pod that I had running. Remember, I changed the number of replicas to 1, so I only expect to have 1 pod running in this particular deployment. And then I can get the services if I want to see the IP address, or as we saw, it was there in the console output as well. So this is the actual publicly exposed IP address for this particular instance that I'm running on Kubernetes. So I can then kick that off, and then I should be able to pull this up inside of a browser. And there is the list of files that are available here. And then I have my super secure password 1 as the password on this. And there's my DOS game. If I go to dir, I can install this. Install this game. This is actually running really fast now because since I actually whacked the other 2 instances of this game that I was running last week on my demo, this ran kind of slow because I had a lot of other pods running on the same CPU, and it really was pretty slow in terms of the streaming output that it was giving me back from the actual output. And it's because the box that this is running on was taxed. This one, it's not, because this is literally the only pod running on this. And so it's the animation is a lot smoother. The game runs a lot cleaner. And we see that I can now play Commander Keen in a browser that was deployed using Azure DevOps to get it up there onto Azure Kubernetes Services using a integration pipeline simply by changing a Docker file and then installing the game whenever it came up. So I hope this was a fun, informative video related to Azure DevOps. Next time we're going to be looking at some other features on Azure Kubernetes Services. And thanks for watching this edition of Tech on Fire with Blaze. If you like this content, please consider visiting us online at www.wintellect.com, and there you can find about services that Wintellect offers, including training and consulting services. Also, please consider subscribing to this channel by clicking on the subscribe button and clicking the bell icon to get notifications when new content becomes available, and also comment down below. You can also follow me on Twitter at @TheOneMule, and also follow Wintellect on Twitter at WintellectNow or at Wintellect. We are constantly posting things about Azure-related technologies and things related to software development. You can also reach us by email at consulting@wintellect.com. Until next time, thank you.